You're listening to Mike Adams and Chris Savory, the record collectors from the BBC, between now and 9 tonight.
Yes, you are. Don't forget the number 0743 248 321. If you want to take part in the programme, if you want us to find records for you, give you valuations, talk about memorabilia, or anything to do with the music business from the 50s to now.
And our very special guest tonight on the Record Collectors is none other than Bobby V, or Bobby Viline, or Bobby Viline, who is touring the United Kingdom. And we welcome a true legend from the 60s. We don't use that word too lightly, because there is so much about you connected with the history of rock and roll, and with people such as the Big Bopper and Richie Valens, and of course Buddy Holly, and the famous night when you sort of sat in. Can we go back to how it all started?
Thank you for the kind introduction, first of all.
Thanks,
nice to see you, Mike.
You're welcome.
And Chris. I was 15 years old, a sophomore in high school, and it's just such a strange sort of series of events that it's hard to even think of in this real world of 1987. But Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper had died in a plane crash after a concert in Clear Lake, Iowa, en route to my hometown to do a concert, and I had my ticket for the show. The local radio station that was promoting the show decided that they wanted to go on with the remainder of the show, which was Dion and the Belmonts, another act called Frankie Sardo, who I've totally lost track of, and a new version of the Crickets. And we're looking for local talent to help fill in the evening, and we sort of volunteered and ended up opening the show that night.
And it wasn't long after that when you actually got a record contract, was it?
Well, it was really, we sort of, it wasn't exactly a record contract. There was a little label in Minneapolis, a couple hundred miles away, that was a regionally distributed label, and primarily country music and polka music, that sort of thing. But it was our main outlet. So we went down and paid $500 and recorded 4 songs in June of 1959. 2 instrumentals and 2 vocals, and we put a record out and went around to the radio stations. At that time, they were very receptive to local product, and lo and behold, they started playing it, and by the end of the summer, we had a #1 regional record.
Because that evening is such a part of pop history, that, like the night Buddy Holly died and Bobby V came in. In fact, you had bigger hits in America than actually Buddy Holly did, of course. What was the atmosphere like that night? I mean, it's a piece of rock history, really. You filled in that evening, but what was the feeling in the hall?
I think that there was a tradition, sort of, that the show must go on, and I think that's the reason that the show did go on. And really, in retrospect, I think everybody was just in shock. I don't think it was a rational decision to put the show on, and I think it was just that people were in shock. They didn't know what to do. The word really, I think that people arrived at the show that night not even knowing that the 3 major stars on the tour were dead.
Right. And
there were about 2,000 people in the Armory that night. And I'm sure every conceivable emotion that you can imagine. I mean, it was just, the backstage area was, I remember Tommy Alsop, who was playing lead guitar for Buddy Holly, was just, his eyes were just glassed over as if he was not there. Mm-hmm. And my brother borrowed a guitar strap from Dion that night, and it was just, it was a teary evening.
To go back, Bobby, to the first recording session that you did, 2 vocals, 2 instrumentals, could you give us some details of what they were and what the label was?
The record label was called Soma, S-O-M-A Records, out of Minneapolis. And the songs were Susie Baby, that ended up being the A-side, and the flip was an instrumental that my brother Bill wrote called Flying High. And then we had a couple other songs that we did on that session. One was called Lonely Love, and the other one was called Strictly Blue, and that was an instrumental, and those 2 were never released.
What instrument did you play on the instrumentals?
Well, Bill was primarily the lead guitar player, but we had played music together. He was my older brother, 5 years older. Is my older brother, I should say. And we really grew up with country music, but we used to switch off playing lead guitar. In fact, Bill had a record that came out shortly after Susie Baby, and I played lead guitar on that for him. So.
And that Susie Baby charted?
Yes.
Yes. What about your brother's record? Did that chart at all?
It was. It unfortunately remained in the region. It was a regional release, and that's where it stayed. But it was. It got top 5 on many of the radio stations around. But he just never had an interest in pursuing it. I guess it was something that I needed to do, and for him it was just he hated traveling and hated packing up and unpacking, and in the end packed it in.
Did you go straight from Sumer? Did you go straight then into a major recording contract, or were you still, shall we say, not being looked at by the majors?
We started getting calls from major labels, Columbia and Capitol, and I remember Roulette Records was wanting to buy the master, and in the end we sold it to Liberty Records, which was a very small company at that time and had very few artists, Eddie Cochran being one of them, Johnny Burnett, the Chipmunks. I always took great pride in that company, right? David Seville. And thinking that it would be the place for us to get good attention, and we indeed did.
I think one of the things which is interesting about your backing group was the Shadows.
Right.
Of course, there's a British group called the Shadows, as well as
one of my favorite groups.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was the start of it. It was Bobby V and the Shadows, wasn't it?
Right.
And you wrote Susie Baby, didn't you? That was your own composition.
That's right.
In, if I may say, a similar style to the Cricket style or Buddy Holly's style. So were you influenced by that music?
Well, I'm sure that I was. It wasn't a conscious effort. It was a 15-year-old impressionable teenage boy, I think, that wrote the song, and Buddy Holly was certainly an influence in my music, as he was, I think, in just about everybody who was making music at that time.
We'll play Susie Baby right now, and on the return, I want to see the connection you have with Bob Dylan.
Okay.
And that was Susie Baby by Bobby V. In the time of the Shadows and Susie Baby, I gather that one unknown sort of guitarist, songwriter actually came auditioning to join your group, one Robert Zimmerman, who failed the audition, or not?
As a matter of fact, he passed the audition.
Passed it!
Maybe to his dismay. We were looking for a keyboard player. This was also in 1959, and thinking that as a rhythm section that it would fill it out a little bit. And my brother, Bill, ran into this guy that was a busboy at a place called the Red Apple Cafe in Fargo, and claimed that he had played, this is a great story, he played piano with Conway Twitty, so he said.
Right.
And of course went right to being a busboy in a restaurant, pushing dirty dishes around. And so Bill took him to the radio station, which was one of the places that we knew had a piano, and auditioned him, and he didn't sound too bad. And we worked him into the band sort of as we went along. In the end, we didn't have any money to supply him with a piano, and he didn't have any, and didn't have a piano. But we let him keep the shirt that we bought him. And he was on his way. About a year later, I was in New York, walking through Greenwich Village, and I saw in a record store a very familiar face from an album cover, and it said Bob Dylan on it. And I checked into it, and sure enough, the boy was Bob Dylan.
Did he actually feature on any of your recordings?
No.
None at all?
No. He played piano on a couple live engagements, and that was it.
In the beginning of the 60s, I mean, you had a lot of hits. You worked with a lot of people at Liberty. You got various arrangers and writers. I believe you were arranged by, was it Ernie Freeman at one time?
Right, one of the great arrangers from that time period.
Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Wonderful man, and I think it's interesting, the pop music that I was making in the early 60s, I think is really looked on as the white teenage market. And here we had a rhythm section from New Orleans with Earl Palmer and Red Callender on bass, and Ernie Freeman, three black men that were making this white teen pop music. Ernie was a brilliant arranger, a brilliant musician, and I think far underestimated by the writers of these days. But he did. He arranged everything that I did for the first 5 years.
I don't know how aware are you that your records in Britain, particularly your early Liberty records and the albums on Liberty, and also the extended play, the old EP recordings that you did, like the Night of the Thousand Eyes EP and so forth, are extremely collectible with a whole sort of like load of memorabilia and people collecting sort of archive, vintage, popular music of the 60s. and they do fetch several times the price of the original value of them. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, no.
In the States also, there's a guide to your records in the States, which records are worth many times more dollars than they were in the original versions. That you were unaware of that interest.
I've never paid much attention to that. I know that people collect records and buy them and sell them and trade them and do all that. But and I have quite a large record collection myself, but only because I've always been a fan of so many different people and just sort of a scavenger. I just collected things and never got rid of it.
Devil or Angel and also Rubber Ball, which was covered in this country by a guy called Marty Wilde.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he did Rubber Ball here, and you were both competing for chart position.
And the Avons.
And the Avons, yes, of course.
I don't know. Maybe you guys know that. I don't know if there's ever been a record that had 3 versions in the top 10 at the same time, before or since.
Yes, I can think of a few. Unchained Melody is the biggest example. Jimmy
3 of
Young, and I think there were 4 at one time.
Oh,
but
my.
That was a little before you even started.
Oh, I remember that.
I think your career in the 60s, your hit career, has been pretty well charted, I think, amongst record collectors. How in a way did it end? And we get that transition to, I think the next time I came across you from memory was, obviously we got rid of Bobby V. We were into, is it Robert Verleen? Is that how you pronounce it?
Robert Thomas
Verleen,
yeah.
which I think was an album I saw with a beard and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
How did we go from that kind of end of Bobby V to this new image?
Well, I sort of grew up on vinyl, you know. when I look back over my life, I can see the different places that I've been by just checking the different albums and records that I've made. Robert Thomas Verleen album came out in the early 70s, and it was really a result of my sort of struggling with my own career and a little bit my life, because my career is part of my life. It isn't all of my life. And I was down in Australia working a hotel down there, and I was working with a big band. I had charts that I would pass out to the musicians, and it was just miserable. I just hated it, and I hated the sounds that were coming past my ears. I wasn't enjoying what was going on, and I was there for 3 weeks, and it was like a life prison sentence. And I decided I just couldn't do that anymore. I'd always been sort of the singer with a rhythm section, and that's what I enjoy. And I'd gotten so far away from all the things that I enjoyed in the business, and I really needed to take some time off, and so I did. I stopped touring and tried to collect myself and figure out what it was that I was even attracted to in the beginning when I recorded Susie Baby. And that led me to writing some songs that were sort of personal to me, I guess. And it was really a very therapeutic time for me. I think the idea of putting it out as Robert Thomas Verleen, if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have taken it that far. I think that was a little too self-centered of me. But in the end, it was a great experience.
You mentioned writing songs. Have you written anything for other artists which have been recorded?
Not really trying to. I've done a couple things. The Crickets recorded a song of mine years ago, and there have been a few songs that have been recorded, but nothing that's ever been a big hit.
Yes. Anything in modern times?
No, I'm doing some writing again. I've never stopped writing, really. I haven't done much recording in recent years, but I am preparing to put an album out next year. And again, it's sort of like the Robert Thomas Verleen album. It's a sort of a labor of love, except it'll be a little poppier.
Yeah.
One of the most popular albums of the 60s, and it actually made #1 in the charts here, was Bobby V Meets the Crickets, which I've got an original copy of here, in the original cover, which is a collectible album, incidentally. Was particularly liked by Buddy Holly and the Crickets fans over here because the sound was so close, and it seemed a particularly well-produced album.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to play something from the album. The tracks of it, I'm sure you're acquainted. Peggy Sue, Bo Diddley, Someday, Well Alright, Looking for Love, Lucille, and The Girl of My Best Friend. I'd like to play a track of that album, but I'd like you to tell me which track you'd like me to play.
Okay. It is an interesting album. When we started doing this album, Someday was Jerry Allison and Earl Palmer on drums, and it started kind of getting heavy. It just wasn't happening. We sort of then threw out the arrangements and just sort of rocked out and did some songs that we all knew. One of my favorite songs on the album was and is a song that was written by Buddy Holly and Jerry Ellison and Joe B. and Norman Petty has his name on it, and it's Well All Right.
And here it is.
Well, that was well all right from the Bobby V meets the Crickets, and of course we've got Bobby V live on the Record Collectors tonight. Something that does interest me, Bobby, is, rightly or wrongly, over here I think we often get the impression that because of this, shall we say, this accident and coming in at the time of Buddy Holly and then later doing an album, Meets the Crickets, we assume that that was your influence. Now, you said earlier on that you were a vinyl collector, so the question is really, was Buddy Holly, the Crickets, your only influence? And if not, what were your influences?
That's a good question, because I think it's true. A lot of people, in fact, there are people that think that I was trying to copy Buddy Holly, which was certainly not the case. Going back as far as I remember, into the late 40s, I used to really like country music, and in fact, it was all country music in my life at that point, Hank Williams and Hank Snow and people like that. In the early days of rock and roll, I used to collect all the Elvis Sun records, and I think those are still some of the best rock and roll records made. Carl Perkins, Matchbox, Glad All Over, some of those songs that weren't necessarily big hits in America, but some great rock and roll records. Loved Eddie Cochran records. One of my very favorites was Ronnie Hawkins, an American singer, Mary Lou, and Dizzy Miss Lizzie, and had some great rock and roll stuff. But people like that.
Well, you actually have champagne taste, because that's some of the rarest rock and roll, the Elvis Sun records, which are extremely rare.
That's what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, you're paying about hundreds of dollars for the Elvis Sun singles today, and of course you mentioned the classic rock singers of the 50s there. And
Gene Vincent, another, I think.
Yes.
I remember seeing Gene Vincent 5 times in 1958 in different concerts.
You saw him at his peak.
Yeah, that was it.
Let's move on to a period where you had a lean period during the British invasion, which we referred to a little earlier, and then you had an absolutely amazing hit throughout the world, but not in Britain, called Come Back When You Grow Up, which I don't know why the British public missed that record, because it's such a good track. It outsold everything else.
Amazing record, yeah. The song was presented to me by a disc jockey friend from Oklahoma City who was in Los Angeles on vacation, and it had been released by a group from Memphis, a regional record, and it sort of peaked, and nothing happened with it. But he loved the song, and he thought it would be a good song for me. And I literally recorded it the next day. We went in and borrowed some studio time from Vicky Carr, who was doing an album, and they took a break, and we said, can we use some time? And they said, fine, and we used some of her musicians, and did the song in about an hour. And I think that's really the way the best records have been made, not by sort of forcing it and jamming the pieces, but we just went in I really hadn't had a hit for so long, I just had no expectations at all. And
that's the nicest time of all, isn't it?
It's the best way, yeah, it really is.
Well, the record, of course, is Come Back When You Grow Up. Come back to Britain anytime to Sold Out Houses. Bobby V, it's been a pleasure having you on the Record Collectors. I do hope next time you're in Britain that you remember us and you pop in.
Well, I certainly will remember you. I really enjoyed speaking with you both, and I wish your show came into my hometown, because I got a feeling I'd really enjoy it.
We're still ambitious. Here is Come Back When You Grow Up by the great Bobby V.